who said, is it possible to recalibrate carbon-14, presumably carbon-14 dating, using objects of a known age, for example, are grown stalactites, etc.? Thanks. Well, you probably wouldn't use the stalactites because carbon-14 is something which you use to test organic materials, but the principle really is actually the same. So let me just give an example that I've been involved in. Archaeology very rarely uses carbon-14, radiocarbon-14 dating in order to find out the age of something. It's usually used as a confirmation technique, and the Dead Sea Scrolls were actually a really good example of how useful carbon-14 dating can actually be. However, if you go for something like Egyptian chronology, now Egyptian chronology is a mess. Even the secular historians admit that to a certain degree, right? And there's lots of discussion and interpretation over the so-called dynasties and how they match together. However, one thing that very rarely gets done is any carbon-14 dating. And there's a good reason for that. We don't really need it. There's a lot of written records from the Egyptians. There's a lot of carvings and pictures and paintings and all this kind of stuff, which have their own unique style to each dynasty. And so archaeologists tend to argue over these chronologies based off of the physical artifacts rather than doing something like carbon-14 dating. However, a group of people, and I'm included in that, are thinking and questioning about, well, can we recalibrate radiocarbon dating? A big group of scientists are working on this. And one of the things that they're doing, we're actually working on some of the artifacts that we have in our museum from a known supposed date. Now, I say known supposed date, by which I mean it has been agreed upon by the general consensus of archaeologists that this particular artifact belongs to this dynasty because of the style, because of the way that it's been produced, because of the location where it was found, so on and so forth. So if you can find something that is a wooden artifact, for instance, and we have some wooden carvings of Egyptians from the sort of older dynasties, so from the sort of middle period back to the early period of Egyptian history, then that is something which we can use to test with radiocarbon-14 date to see whether it matches up with the supposed dynasty age. And what we're finding, interestingly enough, is that the results are coming back much younger than they're supposed to be. So that's something that we're continuing to work on, continuing to put out there. You can find a few references to this kind of stuff online. But John, any comments about carbon-14 dating?
Yeah, you may remember that professor I referred to, the professor of ancient Middle Eastern semantics. I asked him about carbon-14 and I said, okay, now, would you use carbon-14 to date this thing? And he said, well, we could, but we don't. He said it's not being used much anymore at all because here's what we've found. If we had a choice between a carbon-14 date and an actual document, we've discovered the document is far more reliable than the carbon-14, right? The carbon-14 can go all over the place, and the further back you go, the more out from real history it gets. So you have as your outline any dateable object that's got writing on it that you can associate with a certain period of time or mentions a certain in the day when King Uzziah died, right? You wouldn't waste your time carbon-14 dating the original of that because you've got it written as a date in terms of an event. And so he said, given the choice, carbon-14 or a document, we'll go for the document every time. So recalibrate it. No, they don't even bother anymore because you get to get this far out from real history, the further back you go. But the closer you get to the present, the more reliable it becomes because it's actually a short life isotope. So when you are dealing with something 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 400 years ago, it's moderately reliable. But when you're dealing with 2000, 5000 or whatever dates they want, it becomes further and further away from the truth because of the methodology. And sadly, we have to admit that with all of these datings, it is Charles Lyell's ideas that still reign as king over all the earth in their thinking. My aim is to get rid of Moses. So when you want to date Genesis or any of these things, Lyell's aim that gave rise to all the theology, yes, you heard me correctly, all the theology of dating methods is based on the aim of getting rid of the truth of God's word. The world was made in 6 days. Sin came in. Jesus came because of sin. He rose from the dead. And watch out, he's coming back again.
Yeah.
Well,
there's so many problems with the assumptions with C14, and it goes back to, I thought you were going to mention, John, the present is not the key to the past. We don't know what the conditions were, 1,000 years ago, much less 10,000, which is beyond what the Bible teaches. You don't have any measurements of the N14 in the atmosphere and what the rate that it was converted to C14, much less the plants that were eating it and how many plants were there. And it just goes on and on. The assumptions are just so invalid that it's, a general tool for something fairly recent, but beyond that, it's just not accurate.